Welcome to today's deep dive. We're going to be looking at a really interesting argument about the nature of consciousness. We'll be exploring philosopher Nancy J. Holland's book, Heidegger and the Problem of Consciousness, to try to understand her thesis. And, as you might guess from the title, it has a lot to do with Heidegger.
That's right. And Holland's book isn't just like a commentary on Heidegger, though. She actually uses his ideas to create a unique perspective on consciousness, especially when it comes to the mind-body split. So that idea that our mind is somehow separate from our physical body, she argues that that's a misconception with roots in modern scientific thought.
So she's like challenging a pretty fundamental assumption about how we see ourselves. I mean, where does she even begin? Like, how does she unravel this misconception?
One of the key things she does is she re-examines how we understand nature. She argues that the ancient Greek concept of physis offers a more dynamic and interconnected view of the world, as opposed to our more modern scientific view of nature. That static objective realm separated from human experience.
Interesting. So how does that ancient Greek concept of physis differ from our modern understanding of nature? And how does that relate to consciousness?
So for the ancient Greeks, physis referred to the inherent tendency of things to emerge, unfold, and change. It was a much more process-oriented view, like more focused on the becoming of things rather than some fixed essence. And Holland suggests this concept of physis can help us understand consciousness not as the separate entity, but as a mode of that unfolding relational process that we were just talking about.
That makes sense. So instead of seeing consciousness as this thing located in the brain, she's saying that we should see it as a dynamic process that's intertwined with the world around us.
Exactly. And Holland uses a lot of Heidegger's work to support this idea. Heidegger was very critical of modern technology and its tendency to kind of like objectify and control the natural world. And he argued that this mindset alienated us from physis. It led us to see everything as a resource to be exploited instead of this dynamic process of becoming.
So is she saying that our modern way of thinking, which is so influenced by technology, has actually distorted our understanding of consciousness?
That's a huge part of her argument. She thinks that this tendency to objectify and control, which is everywhere in modern science and technology, has extended to how we understand ourselves. We try to find consciousness in the brain, reduce it to neural activity, and doing that misses the lived experience of being conscious, of being in the world.
It's like trying to capture the essence of a flowing river by analyzing a single drop of water. You might learn a little bit about the chemical composition, but you lose sight of the river's movement, its power, its connection to the landscape.
That's a great analogy, and it highlights the limitations of trying to understand consciousness only through that lens of modern science.
So if modern science isn't giving us the full picture, where does Holland go to find a more adequate understanding of consciousness?
She turns to Heidegger, specifically to this concept of Dosing, which is usually translated as being in the world. Now, it's a complex idea, but basically it rejects that traditional subject-object split that dominates Western philosophy. Heidegger argued that we're not these detached observers of the world. We're beings that are always already immersed in a world full of meaning.
Hold on. Being in the world. I mean, could you unpack that a little? It sounds pretty abstract.
Sure. Think of it this way. You can't understand what a hammer is without understanding its purpose, its place in the world of human activity. A hammer isn't just this object with certain physical properties. It's a tool defined by its relationship to the world, by how it's used.
So we're not just talking about physical objects here. We're talking about meaning, how we relate to the world and make sense of it.
Exactly. And for Heidegger, this being in the world is not just a passive state. It's an active process. We're engaging with the world, revealing and disclosing meaning.
So instead of thinking of consciousness as something that's happening inside our heads, we should think about it as this way of being in the world, a way of making sense of things and revealing what matters to us.
That's a good way to put it. And Holland takes this idea and really runs with it. She argues that consciousness is not this separate entity. It's more a way of being in the world. And what characterizes that way of being is a kind of openness to truth.
How does truth fit into the picture of consciousness?
Well, for Heidegger, truth isn't about, matching our thoughts to some external reality. It's a much more dynamic process. It's about revealing. He actually uses this Greek word aletheia, which literally means unhiddenness, to describe the essence of truth.
Unhiddenness. So it's that uncovering what was concealed before, revealing what was hidden.
Exactly. And for Heidegger, this process of revealing, of unconcealment, is very much tied to our being in the world, the way we interact with the world, the things we care about. The questions we ask, all those things contribute to the revealing of truth.
That's a very different way of thinking about truth than the traditional theory that I think most people are familiar with.
Yeah, and it's a way of thinking about truth that impacts how we understand consciousness. Holland argues that Daseins' openness to truth, its capacity to reveal meaning in the world, is what makes human consciousness different from other forms of life.
That's a big claim. So she's suggesting that this capacity for truth, this openness to unconcealment, is what makes human consciousness unique. So our understanding of truth, and therefore, like our consciousness, it's always evolving, always changing as we experience more.
That's it. And that constant process of revealing and concealing, that's what shapes how we understand and experience everything.
But how does that actually work? Can you give us an example?
Well, Holland uses Heidegger's analysis of Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics to show this in action. For Heidegger, we get true understanding when we engage with the world in a way that lets its meaning come through to us. We have to actively participate in this process of disclosure.
So it's less about finding an objective truth out there somewhere and more about, like, being open to what the world shows us through our experiences.
Exactly. And that's a key part of understanding how Heidegger sees consciousness. He's saying that this whole process of truth as disclosure, it's completely tied up with our awareness and how we exist in the world.
Wow, okay. This is definitely a totally different way to think about truth and consciousness than we usually do. It's like Heidegger is saying we have this much more active role in creating our understanding of the world and how we fit into it. This is definitely giving me a lot to think about.
For sure. And we're just getting started. What's really interesting is that while Heidegger is all about this revealing, he also acknowledges that there are limits to what we can understand. He has this concept of untruth or concealment that he calls leith.
Ah, so there's a flip side to this whole truth as disclosure thing. Tell me more about that.
Well, Heidegger talks about three specific forms of untruth: concealing, dissembling, and misinterpreting. He's basically saying that even when we're trying our best to understand the world, we're always running into these forms of untruth.
So are you saying that our understanding of the world and therefore our consciousness is kind of like inherently limited, maybe even flawed?
That's part of what makes this all so complicated, right? Heidegger says these limits are just part of how we are in the world. Our consciousness is always vulnerable to mistakes, to distortions. He even goes so far as to say that the essence of truth is untruth.
Wait, hold on. That doesn't make sense. So you're saying truth is like inherently unreliable.
It's not that simple. Heidegger's being more subtle here. It's not that we can never know anything for sure. It's more that truth and untruth, they're intertwined. Our understanding of the world, it can never be complete, never absolute.
So we're always moving back and forth between these moments of understanding and moments of being in the dark.
Right. And that tension, that back and forth, that's at the core of Heidegger's idea of truth and how it connects to consciousness. It's not about reaching some final objective understanding. It's about constantly engaging with the world and being open to how it reveals and conceals itself to us.
Okay, I think I'm starting to grasp just how complex Heidegger's view is.
Hmm.
But I'm still not sure how all of this connects back to the problem of consciousness. How does this truth as disclosure and concealment idea move us past the classic mind-body problem?
That's a great question, and it's something that Holland gets into deeply. She argues that by understanding Dasein and Aletheia, we can move beyond that traditional mind-body split.
You mean, like, consciousness for Heidegger, it isn't just a product of the brain?
Exactly. Instead, it's deeply tied to this idea of being in the world, to that active engagement with the process of revealing and concealing truth.
Okay, I see the bigger picture now. So Heidegger's not saying consciousness is like a puzzle we need to solve, like a scientific problem. It's more about recognizing how central it is to who we are as beings in the world.
You got it. And Holland really emphasizes that this is what makes Heidegger so relevant to how we talk about consciousness today. He gives us a totally new way to think about it, a way that moves past those old dualisms and embraces the complex relationship between us, truth, and the world.
This has been, well, a lot to take in, but really insightful. So for our listeners who might be just joining us on this Heideggerian adventure, what would you say is the key takeaway from Holland's book so far?
The biggest takeaway is that through Holland's analysis, Heidegger is asking us to completely rethink how we understand consciousness. He's pushing us away from that idea of consciousness as just a product of the brain, something to figure out like a science problem. Instead, he puts it right at the heart of how we exist in the world with this dynamic and ongoing interaction with truth, how it reveals and conceals itself to us.
It's been a dense but really fascinating exploration of Heidegger's ideas. And I know we've got a lot more to unpack. Can you give our listeners a little preview of where we're headed next?
Sure. In the next part, we're going to get into Heidegger's concept of the nothing, and we'll see how this, well, seemingly abstract idea is actually crucial to understanding his view of consciousness and human freedom. We'll also look at how Holland ties these ideas to contemporary discussions of artificial intelligence, which is pretty interesting. Heidegger might have some surprising things to say about technology, even though he was, pretty critical of it.
I'm already intrigued. Listeners, join us for part 2 as we continue our deep dive into Heidegger's world and explore just how far his thinking can take us in understanding, well, ourselves and the very nature of consciousness. Okay, wow, I'm still processing everything we talked about in part 1. That idea of consciousness being all wrapped up in how the world reveals itself to us, it's pretty mind-bending.
Yeah, it definitely makes you think differently. And remember how we touched on Heidegger's idea of Leith? That element of concealment or untruth that's like always there.
Yeah, that felt like we were left hanging a bit. We were talking about truth being this, dynamic process of revealing and concealing. You said Heidegger calls that concealing side Leith, right?
Exactly. And Holland points out that Leith is closely connected to another really important idea in Heidegger's philosophy, the nothing.
Okay, the nothing. Now, this is where I feel like I'm going down a philosophical rabbit hole. Isn't nothing just, well, the absence of something? What makes it so important for Heidegger?
That's what makes Heidegger so interesting. He wants us to go beyond those everyday understandings of concepts, like nothing. Holland emphasizes that for Heidegger, the nothing isn't just an absence. It's more like this, a powerful force that shapes how we understand the world and ourselves.
Wait, a force? How can nothing be a force?
Okay, try to picture this. A sculptor, they're looking at a block of marble, right? It's the emptiness, that uncarved space, that makes it possible for sculpture to emerge.
Ah, I see. The nothingness of the marble. It's like the potential for creation. But how does this connect to consciousness?
Heidegger says the nothing is really tied to freedom because it's open, undefined, it allows for choices, creativity to act and shape their world.
So you're saying if there was no nothing, we'd all be like robots just following pre-programmed instructions.
You could see it that way. Without the nothing, without that emptiness, there would be no room for spontaneity, change, all that unpredictable stuff that makes us human. And Holland really emphasizes this point. Without the nothing, there's no way to even understand being itself.
Wow. Okay, so the nothing isn't something to be scared of. It's actually like the source of possibility and freedom.
Exactly. And it's directly linked to consciousness. Heidegger argues that it's through our awareness of the nothing, of our own limits, our finitude, that our consciousness becomes fully realized.
This is really challenging how I usually think. How can being aware of nothingness make us more conscious?
Well, think about it. When we confront the nothing, we confront the ultimate unknown, right? And that forces us to question everything, our assumptions, our beliefs, even our basic understanding of how the world works.
So it's like the nothing acts as a mirror, reflecting back our limits and making us dig deeper.
That's a great way to put it. It's through that reflection, that grappling with the void, that we become truly aware of ourselves and our place in the world.
I have to admit, this is making me completely rethink what consciousness even is. It's not just about thoughts and perceptions. It's about this deep engagement with the unknown, with the nothing itself.
And this is where Holland's argument might get a little controversial. She follows Heidegger in claiming that animals, while they may have complex cognitive abilities, are poor in world compared to humans.
That's kind of a loaded phrase. Poor in world. Could you unpack that a bit more?
Basically, Holland is arguing that animals, while they're good at navigating their environments and responding to stimuli, they don't have the capacity for abstract thought, for self-awareness, and the kind of open-ended questioning that characterizes human consciousness.
So it sounds like she's saying that while animals can be intelligent in their own way, they don't have the same kind of access to truth or that capacity for revealing meaning in the way that humans do.
Exactly. And this difference, she argues, is rooted in design's unique structure, its way of being in the world.
Okay, I think I'm starting to understand the basic outline of Holland's argument. She's using Heidegger's concept of Dasein to reframe our understanding of consciousness. And she's seeing it not as a separate entity, but as a mode of being in the world that's characterized by this kind of openness to truth.
You got it. And it's from this foundation that Holland develops her critique of all sorts of contemporary theories of consciousness.
All right. I'm ready to dive into that. What are some of those theories that she takes issue with, and how does she use Heidegger's ideas to kind of challenge them?
Welcome back to our deep dive into Nancy J. Holland's Heidegger and the Problem of Consciousness. Last time we were talking about how Holland uses Heidegger's ideas to critique some of the popular theories of consciousness out there. And she finds them sort of lacking, like they don't fully explain that mind-body relationship,
Hmm.
or they don't really capture what's unique about subjective experience.
Right. What are some of the theories that she kind of picks apart?
Oh, she tackles quite a few. Like, for example, she looks at Gerald Edelman's theory of neural Darwinism, which looks at how the brain develops and changes over time through experience using like an evolutionary framework.
Can you give us like a quick recap of Edelman's theory and why Holland has a problem with it?
Sure. Edelman compares the brain to the immune system. He says that neural pathways are always competing, and the ones that are best at responding to stuff in the environment get stronger. Kind of like how the immune system picks out and strengthens antibodies.
So like a process of natural selection happening inside the brain.
Exactly. And according to Edelman, that process is what leads to consciousness. But Holland says that while his theory is interesting when it comes to explaining certain brain functions, it doesn't really account for that, the subjective quality of consciousness, like what it feels like to actually experience the world.
So she's saying that Edelman's theory, even though it's based in biology, doesn't really connect the dots between what's happening in the brain and the experience of being conscious.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it.
Huh.
And she makes the same critique about other theories. She looks at like neurophenomenology, which tries to bridge the gap between like neuroscience and subjective experience.
I've heard of neurophenomenology. It really focuses on first-person accounts of conscious experience and then tries to match those accounts with brain activity. What's Holland's problem with that?
Well, she likes that neurophenomenology tries to include subjective experience when it studies consciousness, but ultimately she thinks it's too focused on just correlating brain states with mental states. It still treats consciousness as something that can be objectively measured and explained, instead of being a fundamentally relational and revealing process, as Heidegger would put it.
So even though neurophenomenology tries to take subjective experience seriously, it still gets bogged down in that traditional scientific framework that wants to nail down consciousness as this like thing or process that can be observed and measured.
Exactly. And this brings us to another theory that Holland critiques, Max Wellman's idea of reflexive monism.
Okay, I haven't heard of that one. Can you explain it?
So reflexive monism suggests that the brain creates consciousness as a reflection of the material world. So in a way, consciousness is an illusion, but it's a useful illusion because it helps us to interact with our environment.
Interesting. So it's kind of like saying that consciousness is like a virtual reality simulation that the brain makes.
Yeah, that's a good analogy. And Holland thinks it's clever how reflexive monism tries to reconcile subjective experience with the material world. But in the end, she says it still falls short because it boils consciousness down to a byproduct of what the brain is doing.
It's like she keeps coming back to this idea that consciousness isn't something that the brain makes. It's more about a way of being in the world, a way of revealing meaning.
Right, and that's where Heidegger's idea of being in the world is so important for Holland. She's saying we need to change our whole perspective. Instead of trying to find consciousness in the brain or reduce it to neural processes, we need to see it as this fundamental part of our existence, our being in the world.
So she's calling for a pretty big shift in how we approach the whole question of consciousness. Like, instead of trying to solve it like a science problem, she's saying we need to reframe the question itself.
That's a great way to put it. And this change in perspective, she argues, has huge implications for how we understand ourselves, our relationship to the world, and even the nature of reality.
This is all really thought-provoking. But I have to admit, I'm still wrapping my head around some of what Holland's suggesting. Like, if consciousness isn't made by the brain, then how do we explain that clear connection between them? I mean, we know that if the brain gets damaged, it can really mess with our mental states, even our sense of self.
That's a great point. And Holland isn't denying that the body plays a crucial role in how we experience the world. But remember, she's questioning the traditional way we frame the mind-body problem. She's not saying that the mind is separate from the body, or that the body causes consciousness.
So how does she explain that relationship between brain and consciousness if it's not about one causing the other?
She uses Heidegger's concept of psyche, which is often translated as soul, but Heidegger saw it differently. He didn't think of it as a separate thing, but more like the relationship between a living being and its world.
Okay, that's a little hard to grasp. Is there like an example that could help explain that idea?
Sure, Holland actually uses a pretty unexpected example: zombies. She compares traditional voodoo zombies, the ones controlled by a necromancer, with those modern pop culture zombies that are driven by their own hunger.
Zombies. Wow, didn't see that coming in a deep dive about philosophy.
Well, sometimes you need a bit of pop culture to make these complex ideas clearer. But seriously, think about what this difference between types of zombies tells us about consciousness. Does a being have to be self-directed to be conscious? Those voodoo zombies, they're animated, right? But they're not autonomous.
That's a really good question. It seems to get at what makes a conscious being different from just a machine.
Exactly. For Heidegger, being in the world always includes this sense of care, like a concernful engagement with the world. It's this care that gives our lives meaning and direction, even without some controlling master, like you see with voodoo zombies.
So a being that can care, that can have a concerned engagement with the world, shows a kind of consciousness that goes beyond just being biologically animated.
Precisely. And this capacity for care, for engaging with the world meaningfully, is what Holland, building on Heidegger, sees as what defines Dasein.
This is making more sense now. It's not just about having a brain or reacting to stuff. It's about that deeper level of engaging with the world, that sense of care and concern that shapes what we do and gives our lives meaning.
You got it. And this brings us to another key part of Holland's argument, the role of truth.
Okay, we talked about truth as unconcealment. But how does that idea connect to Dasein's capacity for care and being engaged with the world?
Well, for Heidegger, it's the capacity for truth that sets Dasein apart from other beings. Animals might show complex thinking, but they don't seem to have that capacity for abstract thought or self-awareness that marks human consciousness. And here's where Heidegger's thinking gets a little controversial, because he says animals are poor in world compared to humans.
We talked about that earlier. Doesn't she worry about coming across as anthropocentric?
She actually addresses that directly. Holland defends Heidegger, saying he wasn't putting animals down. He was just trying to highlight how human consciousness engages with meaning and possibility in a way that's different.
So she's not saying animals aren't intelligent, just that their intelligence is different.
Exactly. And she brings up current research on animal cognition to back this up, like Franz de Waal's work. It shows that animals can do some pretty impressive mental stuff, but they don't seem to get abstract ideas or think about their own existence the way humans do.
That's a good point. Like, our pets can be really smart, but they don't seem to have the same kind of self-awareness we do.
Exactly. And it's that capacity for self-awareness, for reflecting on our own being, that ties back to Heidegger's idea of truth. He argues that Dasein is open to truth. It has this capacity to question and try to understand things in a way that goes beyond how science studies the fixed behavior of objects.
This makes me think about how kids are always asking why. It's like that questioning, that drive to understand is a big part of what it means to be human.
That's a great observation, and Heidegger would probably agree with you. He sees that capacity for questioning, for seeking truth, as a fundamental aspect of Dasein.
This is all really fascinating. But how does this Heideggerian understanding of consciousness, which is very philosophical, actually play out in real life? Does Holland give any examples of how changing our thinking like this could impact how we live?
She does. In fact, she argues that this shift in perspective, using Heidegger's ideas, can really change how we approach things like education, designing our cities, and how we interact with nature.
Okay, I'm really interested to hear about this. How does she see Heidegger's thinking influencing these parts of our lives? Welcome back to our deep dive into Nancy J. Holland's book. We've been exploring how she uses Heidegger's ideas to understand consciousness. And in the last two parts, we've really been focusing on her core argument, that consciousness isn't something the brain produces, but a way of being in the world, characterized by care and openness to truth. You mentioned that Holland sees this perspective, this Heideggerian view, as having some real-world implications. Can you tell us more about that?
Absolutely. Holland argues that moving away from the scientific model that tries to explain consciousness and moving towards this Heideggerian view that focuses on our way of being has big implications for how we deal with all kinds of things, like education, how we plan our cities, and even our relationship with the natural world.
Let's start with education. How does a Heideggerian view of consciousness change how we think about learning and teaching?
Well, for Holland, it really challenges that traditional model of education, the one that's so focused on just giving information and teaching technical skills. She'd rather see an approach that puts more emphasis on cultivating curiosity and a sense of wonder, encouraging students to engage with the world in a more open and questioning way.
So it's about encouraging that openness to truth.
It's about getting students to ask, why? to look at things from different angles and to develop their own understanding of the world, not just soaking up facts and figures.
That makes a lot of sense. So it's about going beyond memorizing things and taking standardized tests and moving towards a more holistic and, I guess you could say, embodied approach to learning.
Exactly. And this shift in how we think about education would mean changing our learning environments too. Instead of boring classrooms and rigid lesson plans, Holland imagines spaces that spark creativity, exploration, and a connection to the natural world.
So more hands-on learning, outdoor classrooms, maybe interdisciplinary projects that bring different subjects together.
Yes. And she also thinks it's really important to include art, music, and other creative things in what we teach.
So it sounds like she's suggesting an approach to education that helps students develop their minds, but also their imagination, their emotions, their ability to think critically.
Right. And she thinks that this kind of education would not only help students deal with the challenges in the world today, but also help them find more meaning and purpose in their lives.
This is all very inspiring. But let's move on to urban planning. How does Holland see Heidegger's ideas influencing how we design our cities?
Holland thinks we need to get away from just focusing on function and utility. That kind of thinking is all over urban planning these days. She thinks Heidegger's idea about design being embedded in the world means that we need cities that create a sense of belonging, community, and a connection with nature.
It seems like she's pushing back against the idea of cities as these machines, just economic engines. And she's arguing for a more human-centered approach to design.
Exactly. She imagines cities with lively public spaces, neighborhoods that are easy to walk around, and plenty of green spaces where people can connect with each other and with nature.
So think more parks, community gardens, streets that are good for pedestrians, places where people can hang out, talk to each other, and feel like they belong.
Yeah, and she emphasizes how important it is to bring art and beauty into the city. She sees that as a way to bring wonder and enchantment into city life, which can often be pretty harsh.
It's about creating spaces that nourish the soul as well as the body.
Absolutely. And she believes that this kind of urban design can create cities that are not only efficient, but also vibrant, livable, and, well, more human.
Okay, we've talked about education and urban planning. What about how we relate to the natural world? How does Holland see Heidegger's ideas shaping our approach to environmental problems?
That's where Heidegger's critique of technology is really important. Remember how he said that modern technology kind of traps the world and makes us see everything as just a resource to be used up?
Yes, and Holland sees that as a big problem when it comes to creating a sustainable and harmonious relationship with nature.
Right. She says we have to move past this idea that nature is just something we use. We need to see its inherent value, its own way of being, and treat it with care and respect.
It's about cultivating a sense of awe and wonder when we look at nature, recognizing that we're part of a larger web of life, not just rulers of the universe.
That's a great way to put it. And she thinks that this change in how we see things would have a big impact on how we handle things like climate change, loss of biodiversity, and pollution.
This has been such a rich and interesting discussion. Holland's book gives us a really unique way to think about consciousness, using Heidegger's philosophy to challenge conventional thinking and give us a new way to see our place in the world. Thank you so much for taking us through all of this.
It's been my pleasure, and I think Holland would say the most important thing to take away from all of this is to never stop asking questions and to keep your minds and hearts open to the mystery of being.